Okay, thanks, Torin. I'm going to read today from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 10. Romans, chapter 10. As I see it, everything we have to talk about is good. It's all good news. There's nothing frightening. There's nothing scary. There's nothing to cause any anxiety. It's supposed to be all good news. That's why it's called the gospel. Gospel means good news. The idea of good news is if this message is called the gospel, that means it excludes the idea of bad news. And I think when we come to church, we should feel better when we walk out and not worse. In fact, if we walk out feeling worse, what was the point of that, you know? And so Paul has got lots of good news. And the reason it's good news, by the way, is because it's not about you and some burden for you to bear or something for you to fulfill or some task for you to accomplish. It's all about Jesus and what He's done. And our part is simply to acknowledge or place our faith in Him where God is concerned instead of in ourselves. So Paul's got a lot to say about that, so I've got one little aspect of it we want to focus on today. There's so many facets to what Paul presents in his letters. There's so many different elements, and they're all good. So today we're going to look at something he has to say here in chapter 10, verse 1. In these chapters of this letter to the Romans, chapters 9, 10, and 11, it's like a little parenthesis in, not little, big actually. In chapters 1 through 8, Paul is presenting this message that he calls the gospel. And in chapters 12 to the end, he's trying to make it practical. In other words, telling you, if you believe in this message of the gospel, here's how you apply it in your lives. But in chapters 9, 10, and 11, it's like a little parenthesis in the middle of his discussion. And he's dealing with the issue of Israel, or the Jewish nation, of which Paul himself, of course, is a part. And the problem or the crux of the issue is how can you understand the fact that Jesus, as John says in the beginning of his gospel, he came unto his own, but his own received him not. For the most part, the nation of Israel in the first century rejected him. And so Paul is dealing with that. But he's also got some really interesting things to say that are helpful for us. And this, in chapter 10, is right in the heart of that discussion. So he says in verse 1, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved." Again, when Paul uses this word saved, he uses it a lot, and its companion word salvation. It is a word that, of course, we're familiar with, and it carries a lot of connotations, churchy kind of connotations. But I like to think about this word just in terms of what it means as a word and just strip away all of our religious associations. This word saved is a Greek word sozo, and its companion word salvation is soteria, both spelled with an S. And they both mean essentially the same thing. One is a verb and one is a noun. They mean a state of favor with God. It means, literally, when you look it up, the Greek words, this word saved is sozo in the Greek, S-O-Z-O. And if you look at it in Strong's Concordance, he gives you a three-part definition. He says it means to be rescued, and then it means preserved, and thirdly, it means safe. A condition of safety, where you're not in jeopardy anymore. The best way for me to illustrate what safe means, and also this word, is to talk about a baseball game. In a baseball game, when the batter runs around the bases, all the time he's running around the bases, he's in jeopardy because the other team is trying to tag him out. But when he slides into home plate, the ump goes like that, makes that big motion, and he says, safe. And what that means is he can't be tagged out anymore. He's not in jeopardy anymore. He's in a position of safety. Now, what Christians think many times in their minds is, well, if I can ever just make it into heaven, then I'll be safe. No, Paul says the thing he's presenting, this message that he calls the gospel, you're in that condition right now, in the here and now. Not to take away heaven in the future, but in the here and now, you're safe. where God is concerned. No more jeopardy. So that's what he says, my prayer to God for Israel is that they might come into this same condition that we as Christians are experiencing. Verse 2, he says, for I bear them record that they have a zeal of God. Zeal, by the way, means energy or enthusiasm, but not according to knowledge. You mean you can have enthusiasm and energy and be completely off base? Yes, absolutely. And we see it many times all around us. You can have a lot of zeal and energy but a misunderstanding. And he says that's what's going on with them. Verse 3 says, for they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he says they are ignorant. May I paraphrase this without reading a bunch of other translations, because this isn't really what I want to spend time on, but let me just paraphrase it. He says they are ignorant of God's way of making people right, or bringing people into a right relationship with him. They don't understand it and they're ignorant of it, and so instead they're trying to do it themselves or establish their own with their own energy and their own work. They're trying to establish a right relationship with God through something they have done instead of, he says, because they're doing that, they have not therefore submitted themselves into what God would do for free. God would put them in that kind of a relationship. That's basically what he's saying. And in Paul's understanding and his presentation of the gospel, that is exactly the condition that a Christian, and that is to say a Christian being a person who simply believes or places their trust or confidence in Jesus, enters into that state of rightness with God, permanent favor with God, and you didn't have to work to establish it. He gave it to you. It's a gift. It's something he has done. So that's what he's saying. They're ignorant of God's way of doing it, so they're trying to do it themselves. Now get the next verse, verse 4. Listen to this now. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believeth. Now what does he mean by that? You know, when we come to the Bible, first question we should ask ourselves is, first of all, what is he saying? In other words, what are the words saying? And then the second question is, what does he mean by it? In other words, what is he trying to get across? What's so important about this that caused him to put it down in writing for us to have? So let's deal with the first one first. What is he saying here when he says Christ is the end of the law, resulting in a right relation with God, and it's for everyone that does one thing, that believes. By the way, notice that he didn't say the first among many things, believe and then do 1,000 other things, or even 10 other things. Simply believe, that is to say, place your trust in Christ. That's the context of it. Then you are brought into this right relationship with God. And you didn't do anything except for place your trust in Christ. He says Christ is the end of the law, resulting in righteousness. Well, here's how you can understand that. Let's say you're traveling down a road towards a destination, and once you arrive at the destination, you have, in a sense, come to the end of the road. In other words, you're traveling, and when you reach the destination, you're no longer traveling. You've reached the end of the travel, the end of the road, so to speak. So that's what he's saying. Christ is the goal, or the end of the road, and results in this state of a right relationship with God. So once you've reached the goal, then the road has fulfilled its function. It brought you to the goal, and then its job is over. Christ is the end of the law. By the law, he means the Old Testament law, what we would call the Old Covenant. the Old Testament. For Jews, it's just simply their scriptures. And so this message that he's presenting here is radically offensive, and was in the first century, radically offensive to Paul's countrymen. That's why he's saying, my heart's desire for them is that they can come into the same relationship with God that I'm telling you about. But they didn't, and they're not, and they have this zeal for God, but they're trying to do it themselves. So he's saying Christ is the end of the road, or the end of the law. It's fulfilled its function. Now, he says pretty much the same thing when he's writing to the Galatians. So, Torin, give me Galatians chapter 3 and verse 22. Galatians chapter 3. There's a lot of parallels, by the way, between Galatians and Romans. He has a lot of the same things, and by comparing them, we can see certain truths from different angles. So in Galatians chapter 3, verse 22, he says, the scripture hath concluded all under sin, that the promise by faith of Jesus Christ might be given to them that believe. Verse 23 says, but before faith came, we were kept under the law. By we, by the way, he means we Jews and the nation of Israel. He's one of them, and they were under the law. It doesn't include, what it doesn't include is you and me. We are, from a Jewish point of view, we are Gentiles. Unless you're born Jewish, you're a Gentile from that point of view, an outsider, in other words. And I think a lot of Christians fail to recognize this, that the Old Testament law, the law of Moses, was never given to you, was never given to me, was never given to the whole world. Moses didn't go on a world tour and say, listen up everybody, this is the law for the whole world. In fact, if you read it for yourself, it says, hear, O Israel. It's a specific thing directed at a limited group of people for a limited period of time. So Paul here is talking. Now the reason, by the way, he's writing to a church, Galatia, and we're reading over their shoulders, comprised mostly of Gentiles, is they, from Paul's point of view, mistakenly, after becoming Christians, turned around and then began to embrace the Old Testament law because people came and told them that they should do that. And if you read the first chapters of Galatians, you find out Paul's really upset about it. He's really beside himself, almost with anger. In the first chapter, he sounds really, really angry. And by the time we get to chapter 3, his anger is kind of cooled down a little bit. He's just merely sarcastic. No, I'm not joking about that. He's really hot under the collar, as we might say. So he's trying to explain what the issue is here. Why he's so adamantly insistent that Christians don't go back to observing the Old Testament law. You know, some people are puzzled about this, and why is Paul so hostile to the Old Testament law, to the Ten Commandments and the law of Moses? Well, let's read this and then let me see if I can explain it. Verse 23 says, before faith came, we were kept under the law, shut up unto the faith that should afterwards be revealed. Verse 24, wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. That is to say, faith in Christ. Just like he said back in Romans when he said, Christ is the end of the law, resulting in righteousness for everyone that believes. He is saying exactly the same thing here. Something you miss, by the way, when you read in English, the English translation of what was originally written in Greek, the fact that different words in English are sometimes used for the exact same Greek words. For instance, back in Romans chapter 10, when he said, Christ is the end of the law, resulting in righteousness for everyone that believes, the word that's translated righteousness is the same word that here is translated justified. It's exactly the same word and same family of words. So justified and righteous mean exactly the same thing. It means brought into a state of rightness or right alignment or compliance or a favor, brought into a state of favor with God. Christ was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ so that we might be made right with God, again, by faith, just like he said back in Romans, by believing or trusting in Christ and what he's done rather than us and what we do. Verse 25, listen to this now. But after the faith is come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. Now, that's pretty plain, is it not? That's pretty clear. Having come to Christ, the law was like a schoolmaster, or to lead you to the goal, like he used the metaphor before. The end, Christ is the result, the end of the road, so to speak. So the question is this: why is he so down on the law? Well, really, he's not. Really, he's not. Let me see if I can explain it this way. Let's just say that you're raised in a rural environment and kind of a place where there's not a lot of technology, and so your whole life you are transported and you get yourself around by a horse and buggy. Now, we can picture that, and we know what that's, we can get a mental image of that. So every time you want to go somewhere, you got to get the horse out of the barn and hook him up to the buggy, and you get in the buggy and you jiggle the reins and the horse goes, and so you go to town and get your supplies. And so that's one way of transportation. But let's just say that some wealthy benefactor comes along and gives you a high performance automobile like a Ferrari or something. So now you've got a Ferrari. You can get in that Ferrari and just turn a key and it roars into life, and you can drive into town in that Ferrari. And so the next day you come out and say, well, get the horse out of the barn and hitch up the wagon and let's go into town. Paul is like saying, why do you want to hitch up the wagon to the horse when you got a Ferrari? In other words, you've got something that is far superior to what was there before. One thing we've got to recognize that Jesus changed everything. When Jesus came into the world, he changed the relationship between God and man. Paul says this explicitly. Jesus changes everything. That's why, by the way, the fundamental thing about the Bible, when you pick up the Bible, the very first thing you should notice is it's divided into divisions that say old and new. Why is one old and the other one new? Because everything has changed. What was formerly the case is no longer the case. And Paul, the apostle, spends most of his time trying to shine the light on the details about everything that has changed in this relationship between heaven and earth, between God and man. Now, that's all preliminary. I just wanted you to see that he's pointing out that this distinction. We've got the high-performance Ferrari, and so he gets really upset with the Galatians because he's like saying, I can't believe you people, for you go back to that horse and buggy when you've got this high-performance Ferrari. And he says a lot of really blunt things to them. In the beginning of chapter 3, he said, "Oh, foolish Galatians." Well, using my analogy, you can see why he says foolish. It's foolishness. But they didn't understand it that way, but he's trying to help them understand it. So what is it how is it that this new relationship with God, why does he keep bringing this up about the law? Well, let's look at something in Hebrews chapter 8, and I think this will shed some light on it. Now, we don't know for a fact that Paul wrote the letter to the Hebrews. Torrin, I'm going to start in verse 7. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 7. We don't know for an absolute fact that the Apostle Paul wrote the letter to the Hebrews, but the early church fathers believe that he did. And for the sake of our discussion, we're going to assume that. But whoever the writer is, he's perfectly in sync with Paul's ideas. Verse 7 in Hebrews chapter 8 says this: "For if that first covenant had been faultless, then there should no place have been sought for the second." You know, one thing I like, by the way, about reading in this letter to the Hebrews, the writer, whoever he may be, does not rely on, like, you better believe me because I say so. He doesn't make arguments like that. He doesn't say, I have authority and so you better believe me because of that. He says, listen to, just think for a moment, use your logic, you know. He appeals to logic rather than authority. So here he's making a logical, he's appealing to your mind, to your logic. And he's saying, think about it this way. If that first covenant, if there was no problem with it, the Old Testament law, then why are we here talking about a second one? And by the way, it's not just that we are here talking about a new covenant, even though Jesus brought it up at the Last Supper when he took the cup and he said, "This is my blood of the new covenant shed for many for the discharge from the penalty or remission of sins." Here he quotes from the Old Testament, which is very a clever thing to do. He quotes from the Old Testament itself, what to us as Christians is the Old Testament, that first covenant. He's going to quote now from Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 8 says, "For finding fault with them," other translations say with it, "for finding fault with it or them," he says, and this now is a quote from Jeremiah chapter 31. Prophet Jeremiah, God himself speaking through the prophet. "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant." A covenant, by the way, is a contract or an arrangement or an agreement. A new agreement or a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Verse 9 tells us, and again he's still quoting from Jeremiah chapter 31, he says, "Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord." When he says in verse 9, he says, "not according to the covenant," he's saying, not like. In other words, it's not like that one. It's completely different. I always think of, when I read this, back in the, I guess it was the 70s, the first Rocky movie came out with Sylvester Stallone. Do you remember, April? Was that the 1970s? We went and saw it, didn't we? I think we went to the Rialto right downtown here and saw that first Rocky, and it was pretty good. You know, I don't know if you've never seen it, you should see it. Sylvester Stallone, and you know they got that dramatic music, da 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 da, and he's running up the steps, you know, and doing that, and you know it's a pretty good story. I mean, I have to admit it's a good story, and I enjoyed it, and it made a lot of money, and it was very successful. Well, you know what happens in Hollywood when something makes a lot of money and it's very successful. We all know what comes next. They're going to make another one. And so we enjoyed that first Rocky movie. And so when they made another one, hoping to make more money and be more successful, we went and saw it. And I can remember sitting there in the theater thinking, you know, this is basically just the same story. This is the same thing, just with some different characters. Right? I think what a lot of Christians think is that the new covenant is just the same thing with some new characters. The same thing with Jesus added. But here he's saying, no, it's not the same thing with some new characters. This isn't a retread of the same. In other words, it's completely different. It's completely built on another premise. It's not according to that covenant. Well, what was the crux of that covenant? Well, the crux of that covenant, that former covenant, was commandments. Thou shalt and thou shalt not. And so the burden was all on the people to perform. And if they performed, then they were rewarded with either blessings or curses. Blessings if they performed not just 50%, not 75%, not do your best, but the requirement was to perform everything that is written in the book of the law, to do it. That was the requirement. And if they performed everything that is written to do it, then blessings. But if not, I'm quoting now from Deuteronomy 28, there's about 14 verses of blessings, but then there's about 30 verses of curses. And it was a frightful situation. And the Apostle Paul, back in Galatians, if we would turn back to chapter 3, which I'm not going to do, he said, it should be evident to you that no one can approach God based on that covenant. Because, he says, the requirement is to fulfill everything that's written in the book of the law to do it. So consequently, that puts everyone under that covenant under a curse. Because, he says, it is impossible to fulfill everything that is written in the book of the law to do it. So, and here this writer is making the exact same argument. It's not just this writer, it's Jeremiah. It's God speaking through Jeremiah. He's saying, I'm going to make a new covenant, and it's going to be completely different. It's not going to be like the old one. And because they couldn't fulfill. They didn't fulfill, they did not continue. And I regarded them not, saith the Lord. And I must make a little digression and just comment. This is my little side comment. The reason the new covenant is successful and superior is because it's not based on commandments. It's not based on you and your performance. It is not even made with you. It's not an agreement with you. And God didn't come down from heaven and get you personally and say, now sign here this contract, and or as they used to do in olden days, open your veins and get your blood and sign it in blood. God didn't do that with me or you or anybody else. He did it with Jesus. And Jesus opened his veins and made a blood covenant. That's why he said at the Last Supper, this is my blood of the new covenant. And it's for the benefit of the many or everyone else. The new covenant is not an agreement between you and God where you have certain obligations to fulfill. It is an agreement between Jesus as a man and God as God. So Jesus fulfills the human requirements. And let me tell you something. Nobody can live up to the requirements except Jesus. So the new covenant cannot fail and is secure. That's why when we use this word saved, and I emphasize the fact that it means you're safe or secure, you are secure and safe because it's not based on your performance. It's based on the performance of the one in whom you trust, your representative, which is Jesus. Jesus is the human that fulfills the requirements. That's why the new covenant, that's one reason it's superior, because Jesus upholds the human side. And God himself obviously upholds the God side. Here, though, he just says, okay, folks, it's different. Well, how is it different? What's the difference? Verse 10. He says, here's the difference. Again, remember, this is the prophet Jeremiah. This is God speaking through the prophet Jeremiah. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. Listen, I will put my laws into their mind, and I will write them in their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. Let's go on reading, then I'm going to come back and comment about that. Verse 11. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. This is talking about direct knowledge of God, direct relationship with God. In other words, you don't have to go to some pastor or some teacher or some prophet or some exalted so-and-so who says, I'm going to go up and hear what God has to say and I'll come back and tell you. It's not like that. I know some Christians fall into that trap of thinking it's like that. Well, I heard brother so-and-so say this, on his TV program. Well, fine, but it doesn't really matter, what brother so-and-so says on his TV program. God says here, this is the way it is now in this new covenant. I will establish a personal relationship with each and every one of you, from the least to the greatest. So even if you think you're the least, you're included here. There's nobody in between who needs to go tell you what God has to say and then come and reveal it to you. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, why are we sitting here in church and you're up there talking? Well, let me tell you, what's the church for? What's the minister for? The minister, whether it be me or anybody else, has only got one function. And the function of the minister is to direct your attention to Christ, from whom all the help comes. Because he's the mediator of this new covenant, not me and not anybody else. So that's what he's saying here. We all have direct access to God. Don't need a prophet, don't need an apostle, don't need anybody like that. Those people, ministers of all stripes and all kinds, have a temporary function. Paul says that. He gave some apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, until we all come to a direct knowledge or personal knowledge of the Son of God. The only purpose of the minister, no matter who he is to direct your attention to Christ. And that's what my job is. So, still not done. We could stop right there and say, wow, this is all really good. But wait, there's more. I like those TV commercials. But wait, there's more. Verse 12. Some of these things that I read, they're so radical, I'm almost afraid to say it, except it's here in print. He says, and again, he's still quoting from the prophet Jeremiah, who at that time was predicting something that was future, but for us is something that is the present tense reality. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness. See, this is acknowledging the fact that we as human beings, part of the human experience is that we're not perfect. You see the word unrighteousness? And he says, I will be merciful to their unrighteousness. You see, that's acknowledging the fact that from the God point of view, he recognizes that we are not perfect, that we are flawed, that we are prone to failure. But instead of getting mad about it, instead of getting upset, instead of cracking a whip or, shooting down lightning bolts to scare you, he says, instead, I will be merciful to their, let's put some other words in there, to their failures, to their flaws, to their faults. I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and, listen to this now, their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. That's like a way of saying, I will not even acknowledge or keep track of. I will remember no more. Well, this just blows a big hole in most people's, most Christians' impression or imagination of what God is and who he is and what he's all about. In talking to people sometimes, I get the impression that sometimes Christians think or have this image, maybe just people in general, we imagine God is like this old man with a long white beard, and he's sitting up in heaven with a big scroll and a feather quill pen, and he's watching everybody, he's writing down everything wrong that everybody does, and it's like saying, aha, you thought you got by with it, but I'm going to get you for that. I know people think that because I've heard that out of the mouths of, I listen to what people say, and it's revealing, what people say reveals what they think. And I've told this story so many times, and there's other ones I could tell, but this is the most clear one. This guy, we were coming out of a church together after this men's meeting, and he just says out into the air, I'm walking next to him, but he just says, speaking to nobody in particular, maybe me, I don't know. He said, I know we've all got to pay for what we've done. He may have, and now that I think about that occasion, he may have actually been speaking to me, because what I used to do at those men's meetings, try to talk them out of their misconceptions, and they got mad about it and didn't ever like it. So maybe he was just trying to get the last word in. Now, all the years I've been telling that story, it finally dawned on me what he was doing. He was trying to tell me how it really is. I know, he says, we've all got to pay for what we've done. Well, this verse says no, just the opposite. He says this is God talking in the person of, through the medium of Jeremiah the prophet. Their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. Well, how can that be? Well, it's because, see, this is what I said, Jesus changes the equation. You have to always factor Jesus into the equation. What was Jesus doing on that cross, by the way? What did he say at the Last Supper when he took the cup and he said, "This is my blood"? In other words, I'm about to shed my blood, and he meant at the cross, that's where he shed his blood, for the remission of sins. For everybody. For the remission means it's gone. Remission means, literally, if you look it up in the Webster's Dictionary, one of the definitions is discharge from penalties. So Jesus has already dealt with the sins and iniquities. So God here says, speaking of this new covenant of which we're living in, their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. They're no longer a factor. Then he sums it up in verse 13. It says, he's again appealing to your logic. He says, "In that he saith, a new covenant, he hath made the first one old." In other words, pause for a moment. What the writer is saying is, by the very fact that God, through the prophet Jeremiah, says new covenant, that automatically makes the first one old. Now, if you look these words up, which I've done, you find out that the word that's translated old here means obsolete, or something no longer in use. He's saying by the very fact that God says, I'm going to make a new covenant, that automatically makes the first one obsolete. He replaces it, in other words. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. In other words, the thing that's old has outlived its usefulness. Or to use my metaphor from a while ago, if you've got a brand new Ferrari, the horse and buggy is no longer of any use to you. Now, here's what I want to talk about. Look at verse 10. Back to verse 10. "For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord." In other words, this is the core of it. This is the key thought. "I will put my laws in their mind and write them in their hearts." What does that mean? Does that mean that God's going to take a Sharpie and you're going to have open heart surgery and he's going to take that Sharpie and write down the 10 Commandments on your literal heart with a literal pen? No, of course not. This is metaphoric language. This is symbolic language. Metaphorically speaking, he's saying that which used to be outside, the 10 Commandments, the Old Testament law symbolized by the 10 Commandments, carved in stone, all external, that you look at it and you try to live up to it. I'm going to take that, and instead of something external to you that you try to live up to, I'm going to change you on the inside and put that inside you as a new nature. Or what occurred to me this week, a way to say it is an internal guidance system. You know, they talk about that sometimes in weapons systems. They have an internal guidance that leads them to the target. What he says is, in this new covenant, here's how it's going to work. There's not something external that you try to live up to. And by the way, the very fact of God giving a law means that what was on the inside of those to whom it was given is wrong. You don't need a law if what's inside is right. He's saying, I'm going to make what's inside right, and I'm going to put inside of you an internal guidance system. So you don't need anybody on the outside to tell you, you need to do this and you need to do that. You've got something far superior. You've got something on the inside that leads and guides and prompts, or like I like to say, something exerts pressure from the inside. And you don't need somebody to explain to you how to apply it in every single detail of your life. All you've got to do is listen to your own conscience. Listen to that internal guidance system that's on the inside of you. Now, this is why Paul gets so adamant and distressed when he's writing to the Galatians and also to the Romans, saying, listen, you've got something that's so much superior to what was in existence before. Why do you want to turn back to the horse and buggy when you've got a high-performance Ferrari? In other words, you've got something on the inside. Let's go back to Romans just for a second. I'll conclude it with this. When I use words like conclude or in conclusion, that's to give you hope. It's not going to last much longer, but I'm going to go back to Romans in chapter 13, but I do want to kind of tie things up here. Romans chapter 13 and verse 8. Now, when we get to chapter 13 of Romans, Paul is now talking about what to him is practical application. In other words, if you place your faith in Christ, if you believe the things he's written so far about the gospel, here's how you put it into practice. And he's trying to make this as practical. This is the practical part. And he's trying to make it as practical as possible. And here's what he says in this particular case. Verse 8 says, "Owe no man anything but to love one another." Now, don't get the wrong idea. He's not talking about borrowing money at the bank. I've heard people say that. I've heard preachers say that Paul commands us not to get loans at the bank. That's not what he's talking about. He's got nothing to say about that at all. He doesn't mean that at all. If you want to know what he means, go back to the previous verse. Torrin, if you could just momentarily. He says in verse 7, "Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." And verse 8 says, owe no man anything. In other words, he's saying in your human relations with people that you interact with, here's how you should look at it. What's my responsibility, in other words, to the people that I'm rubbing shoulders with, to people around me, in your human interactions. That's all he means. He's got nothing to say about borrowing money at the bank. And in this, in our world, if you're going to ever have a house or a car, you're going to have to borrow some money unless you're a TV preacher preaching to everybody don't borrow money. But a person like that can just slap down $10,000 and buy a car. But for the rest of us, we're going to have to borrow money at the bank. Well, just know that Paul is not telling you can't borrow money at the bank. So he's got nothing to say about that. Nothing at all. So all he's saying is in your human relationships, here's the governing principle. Owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth hath fulfilled the law. Let's pause for just a moment. This should connect with you some of the language that we were talking about earlier. What did we read before? Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believes. In other words, that's the goal. You're arrived at the goal. What did he write to the Galatians that we read? The law was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, but having come to Christ, we're no longer under the schoolmaster. So he's saying this, but to love one another. For he that loveth hath fulfilled the law. He's saying there's something that's like your internal guidance system, and then you don't have to worry about all those former requirements because it automatically takes care of that. He's talking about the internal guidance system. But he's not done. Verse 9. See, he's going to quote now from the Ten Commandments, just so you know. So there's no question about what he's talking about. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, in other words, he's saying, if there's any that I forgot here, it is briefly comprehended in this saying. In other words, you could draw a box around it and say, you could sum it all up with this. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Then he explains, verse 10, love worketh no ill to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Now, he's here saying, as Christians, we have a new order of things. We've got an internal guidance system that automatically takes care of what formerly would have been commandments. It's love. It's a kind of, in other words, it's an attitude of care and interest for the other person before yourself. That's what love is about. In other words, let's put it this way. I like to explain it this way. I don't need a law to tell me not to murder you because there's nothing in my heart that, in fact, I would more likely than not lay down my life to rescue you. Imagine a child wanders out into the street and a car is coming down the street. What parent would not dive into the street to rescue their child at the risk of their own life? Why do they do that? They're prompted by their love for that child. So you don't need a commandment telling you what love prompts you to do. It's a superior motivation, in other words, a superior system. It's an internal prompting. It's an internal guidance system. I don't need a commandment telling me not to steal from you because I would just as likely as not give you what I have rather than do that. Love is a superior motivation. It's an internal guidance system. When he says love worketh no ill to its neighbor, it means I'm not going to, if I'm motivated by this new, you see, what did we read back there in Hebrews? This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, saith the Lord. I will write my law into their hearts and in their minds. God says, I will put it in there. I will do it. So at some point as Christians, we've got to just believe that that's what he does. In fact, it is what he does. When we, and see, what's our access? What's our point of entry? What's our connection into this? Just one thing. Paul brought it up. He said, to everyone that believeth. What does it mean to believe? It means to transfer your confidence from yourself to Christ. And then he does the rest. He creates that internal guidance system on the inside of you so that you don't need anybody to tell you what to do or what not to do. You know perfectly well for yourself in your heart that is now enlightened and brought into a new state of being by God himself. Okay, I think that's all we got today. Any prayer requests before we go? Does anyone need prayer for anything? Yes, Ed.